Good morning, everyone, and I'll give you a very warm welcome to this webinar, Developing a Robust Drug and Alcohol Policy. I'm Dr. Dan Hegarty, the CEO of Express Medicals. I'm delighted to be introducing this session, which will be delivered by Mike Stallard. Mike has more than 25 years' experience of working in the field of drug and alcohol screening and testing. He has a wide experience in the railway industry, which included having responsibility for managing and delivering the drug and alcohol testing programs for London Underground. Whilst at London Underground, Mike authored and delivered a variety of workshops and seminars and awareness programs around drug and alcohol testing. Mike has also authored and delivered a whole variety of training programs for collection officers across a wide range of other sectors. His career has also included a 4-year stint on the board of the European Workplace Drug Testing Society. During his tenure, he organised 2 international conferences on the subject of drug and alcohol testing. Mike has been a non-executive director at Express Medicals for around 8 years now, and has actually provided professional advice to us for around 16 years. There will be the opportunity to ask questions, so please do send them through to the Q&A box. We will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. If there are any questions that we don't get round to today, we will answer them afterwards by email. In answering questions, Mike will be supported by Dr. Simon Davis. Simon is a very senior research scientist at Imperial College London and an expert in drug analytical science. Simon also acts as a scientific advisor to our company. I'm sure the session is going to provide a lot of interesting information, and so without further delay, and apologies for the technical hitch at the beginning, I hand you over to my colleague Mike Stallard.
Good morning. Hopefully you can help hear me. Yes, yes, nodding of heads. Great, yep. Great stuff. Okay. Well, as it's already been explained, today we're going to concentrate on how to put a policy together and from a robust point of view. I have to say some of the questions you're going to be asking me, we won't have the answers because you yourself as the employers will know the answers themselves. You'll have to ask your own questions about it, and that will come up as we go through the processes. So what we're going to try to do this morning is to give an overview of the trends and the use of drugs in society at the moment, and the potential impact that will have on you as employers in your workplace, to give advice on how to develop a robust drug and alcohol policy, and also to supply a framework of useful tips. So basically we're going to walk you through some of the things that self-questions you can ask yourselves and also put those into place when developing your policy. Now, we just to look a bit about a wider scale. I mean, as far as the history of drug usage has been concerned, it's been around for the term donkey's years, but even wider than that. We know that opium, hashish, mushrooms and cocaine have been traced right the way back through ancient history. They've been out there. Roman writer Tacitus, in terms of in breach of Health and Safety at Work Act, complained the fact that there were lots of workplace injuries with people falling off scaffolding when they were building. In World War I, the use of morphine that was being used on injured soldiers resulted in a lot of addiction when they came back. And of course, when the development of amphetamine was discovered, they were adopted by both sides for their troops and giving them that Dutch courage. It was also used in many fields out in Vietnam in terms of keeping troops more active. So they've been around a long time. But you're more concerned with the workplace. Now, if we take a picture of what's going on at the moment, and these recent surveys which have just been done, a lot of it comes through the EU, combined with looking at all the countries in Europe who supply data on a regular basis. The most recent surveys show that in England about 9.4% of usage, Wales 12, and in Scotland about 5.9. 12% in Wales and Scotland, 12% and 5.9 in Northern Ireland. The most commonly used drugs are cannabis, followed by cocaine, MDMA, ketamine, and amphetamines. The UK has the highest use of crack cocaine in problems in Europe, and Scotland has increasingly had an ongoing problem over the several years of having the highest death rate recorded by any country in Europe, with more than 1,300 people dying of drug misuse. So it's a big problem in terms of society out there. We've also probably, you're now aware of what used to be called the legal high. These are laboratory developed drugs which started out probably about 10, 15 years ago. The internet has impacted on that, with people being able to go and order these particular substances, and eventually legislation was put in place by the UK government, but there's some suspicion that's still going on. COVID, of course, has also impacted on drug treatment centres where people couldn't get together to be seen, and that's had an impact in terms of face-to-face. So what does that mean to you then? Well, as an employer, what they're basically saying that as far as society's problems are concerned, they don't stop when they turn up at your front door or come to work for you. What's going on out in society will, in its sense, come into your workplace. So in the sense, if you employ a liar, when he comes to work for you, they're not going to stop lying, and that will apply to many other conditions that they may have outside of work, and they will creep into your employment. So if you've got a person employing someone who is a user, then the possibilities they will still use when they come and work for you. The issues for you is, are they using whilst they're at work? If they are supplying drugs outside, will they be coming into you and supplying drugs in the workplace? And the last bit on that slide, that comes from an addict. And I will sort of point out a little bit here, there is a big difference between an addict and a user. An adder as an addiction would probably love to get off the drug, but have great difficulty in getting off of them, and the social problems that revolve around them. But more important, probably a lot of the employees will be users, and they use because they want to. And they see it as their right that they want to use it, and they are going to be a different type of individual you're going to be dealing with. So why would you, having heard of that, want to put together first of all, just a policy? Well, that comes down to you as an employer to understand. You have to ask yourself, well, what will be the impact on my business of a drug or an alcohol-related incident? Will it interfere with your damage of your company? Will it reduce client and customer confidence? Are there legal implications on you if an accident should occur? And are there financial repercussions of an incident occurring with you? You know the answers to that. The other thing, which of course, especially in today's environment, there's the cost. And that again comes back to your decision scales. You have to look, how much will it cost to introduce, for instance, if you decide a testing regime, but you need to balance that against what is the cost to you as an organisation by not doing it. Again, they're questions you can only answer. Bit of historical evidence here to sort of show you of what happened when it goes wrong. Go back to '89, the Exxon Valdez. The captain of that ship was known to be basically a drunkard, but he could turn the ship around very quickly. And at the time of the Exxon Valdez, he was in his bed, in his cabin, recovering from, shall we say, large quantities of alcohol. 1991, the Cannon Street Rail crash. 2 people got killed, 542 passengers were injured. That resulted in the Transport and Work Act coming into place, 1992. That was because legislation took place. Now, that was because they discovered at the time the driver had been taking marijuana. They weren't sure whether he'd been taking it at the time of the accident, whether he was taking it before the accident, or whether he was taking it after the accident. But what's interesting in terms of how people slow to move, that in 1972, there'd been another rail crash which killed 5 people, and the driver was later found to be intoxicated. And then, of course, we're most coming up to date, we've got the 2015 German Wings, where 150 passengers were killed. As a result of that, now within the aviation industry, there is legislation in place where cabin crew will be tested on a regular basis in terms of what drugs they're taking. And that's gone right across Europe. So it's sad to say, in many cases, it takes a major incident to occur before people actually do something about it. And in these situations, it was legislation. The other thing, of course, people do not walk around with signposts saying, I'm an addict or I'm a user. So it's not that easy, actually, to discover who is using. So let's talk about putting a policy together. First of all, what is it? Well, a policy is your formal statement of intention, but it should clearly state the rules and the procedures for dealing with the issues of substance misuse. It must be consistent with your other company employee guidelines and contracts, but be very careful. Don't try to complicate it too much. If you can link it with some of your other policies, all the better. So who does the policy cover? Now, many organisations differentiate between their employees who carry out the safety-related tasks, known as safety critical tasks. So these are people who will be on the work floor using machinery, and not perhaps people who work in the administration side of things, the clerical side, although they may be covered under other types of testing. Your compliance will be with any legal requirements, giving support to your managers and supervisors to deal with the substance misuse in the workplace, demonstrating something we use all the term, this term of due diligence with regard to the health and safety of your employees. It should establish clear guidance for dealing with misconduct as a result of substance misuse, and also should raise awareness amongst your employees for the potential effects of drugs and alcohol and the potential impact upon individuals in the workplace. And it's up to you, decide that how do you support that policy, and that tends to be as a result of introducing a testing regime in your workplace. One of the aspects of drug and alcohol, I'm certainly involved in testing, is we use in the industry this term of carrot and stick. What do we mean by carrot and what do we mean by stick? Well, in simple terms, the carrot is if you come forward with a problem, we as an employer will help you. The stick is if you don't come forward and you get involved in the test and the test finds that you're positive, then the likelihood is we'll dismiss you. When we talk about assistance, however, again, could be some financial implications on you as an employer. Now, I'm not saying to you that you don't introduce the carrots, but there are financial implications could be involved in terms of also treatment. What do you do as far as treatment's concerned? Do you just assist them financially with treatment, or do you just give them leave to do it? Again, treatment tends to take some time. It's not something 1 week in a clinic and they come back fine. It could enter into months where you will have to be looking after those individuals. And also you have to have the support functions of when they actually finally do come back to work in terms of ensuring that there's no relapse. So a lot of companies will do this. They will offer the carrot and it will be a positive approach to them. And it's also sometimes it's a way of confirming buy-in from employees if you're going to introduce a drug and alcohol policy, especially if you've got trade unions involved, who will be more acceptable to you introducing it, where you offer this carrot that we will look after people if they are prepared to come forward. And I would advise you not supporting them if they're found to be found to fail a drug test. It should always really be people who are prepared to come forward. Also, you have to make it very explicit what the repercussions are of an employee who is tested positive for drugs or alcohol, and what action the company will take under those circumstances. And generally, it will normally include disciplinary, which tends to involve dismissal as well. So some of the challenges you face in terms of getting buy-in from all the employees, including your managers and your supervisors. We've worked with industries where, in the sense that even the managers are not happy of it being introduced, and acts as almost a small roadblock in terms of doing it. You have to ensure that you can trust your managers and supervisors to manage the drug and alcohol policy, especially if it's including testing. We use the term collusion. Again, collusion can be rife inside of a company. If you don't get a manager or supervisor who's prepared to accept, he can quite easily tip off staff if tests are going on. He can turn a blind eye in terms of that situation. We also find under this where companies may decide to train their own staff, and we do a lot of training for companies who want to carry out testing by their own staff. But the danger even with that is there's a potential of collusion where a person is testing an employee, the employee turns the tables on the individual, says, look, John, you know me, I've been here years and years and years, you know what's going to happen now if you report me, I'm going to lose my job, etc., etc. And there's quite easy ways to dodge the test. So collusion is something that you have to expect could be in place when you introduce drug and alcohol testing. We can't forget the fact about alcohol. People tend to think of drugs, and then everyone thinks about cannabis and all those type of drugs. Well, of course, it's alcohol as well. Now, a lot of companies, they go for what we call the zero tolerance model, which basically says no alcohol consumption at work, including breaks or on call. No buying alcohol whilst at work, even for consumption later. So in other words, they're not allowed to bring it onto the premises. Limiting the consumption prior to work, and no consumption whilst wearing uniform, i.e. individuals who might be going into a pub in uniform could give the wrong impression of the company. And the Road Traffic Act is a big issue for employees, and I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about this. Many companies automatically adopt the Road Traffic Act, which is 35. And they don't, what you really have to think about is, if you were to do that, are you saying therefore it's acceptable if you've got lorry drivers or vehicle, that if they're tested and the test comes out as 34, you're going to be happy to allow them to get back into the cab and go off down the road? Even if they're 35, are you accepting the fact that you might get a telephone call from one of your clients who says, by the way, your member of staff has just turned up here and he's smelling of alcohol? And you have to say, well, actually, he's all right. We've tested him. He's fine. So you get that image. If you also have got people driving perhaps into Scotland, you have to recognise the fact in Scotland it's 22. So your 35 doesn't match the Scottish limit. So how do you get around that? Some industries.
32 or 22?
Sorry.
Did you say 32 or 22?
22 in Scotland.
22. Thank you.
So one of the things you have to do is consider that. So one of the things you need, a lot of other companies, on the other hand, use the RAL, which is 13. And if you're over 13 in the RAL industry, you're sacked. It's as simple as that. So if you need to adopt a level that is manageable for you, and also you have to support that with what if, although it might not meet the limit, it's under. So what does a manager do? For instance, if you go for 35 and the man comes in or woman comes in on 25, what do you do? And you need to look at that. Do you send them home? Do you warn? There's still part, maybe if you've got a zero tolerance level which says you know, we do not expect you to turn up to work with alcohol in your system. You need to still have a situation where perhaps even it's a severe warning or something like that, or what you're going to do, whether you allow them to carry on work, etc., etc. Whereas the top limit is normally a dismissal. So it's a very, very complex situation, and you really do need to look at that. So just briefly, we've decided, you know, you're going to write a policy. Well, how do you manage? And the fact is we screen. Generally, the way that we would go forward, we would screen. Then there are various methods. First of all, the pre-employment one. Well, that's known as the gatekeeper. You're not employing people who perhaps already have got a drug or an alcohol problem. Transfer and promotion, that falls under this situation where you may decide that you will formally train and formally test people in a safety critical, but not people who work in a clerical. And if those clerical individuals transfer into a safety critical job, then the first thing would be that they would be tested first of all. Random testing, this works normally on a percentage basis where you as a company will say that we will test, and I always emphasize this, a minimum. Never use the term maximum, because out there they've got calculators, they can count these quite easily. If your maximum is 5%, they say, well, 5%, they've tested 5%, we're all right now, the testers aren't coming back. So you should always test the minimum. That ranges from as much as 5%, minimum as 5, up to 10, 20 by some industries. Now, for cause is where you as a manager have reason to believe that an individual is under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Now, this for cause would generally also apply to everybody. So this would also apply to administrative staff and managers as well. Post-incident tends to fall more under your health and safety, because what post-incident tends to say is an incident where possible injury, damage could have occurred. So in that situation, if a forklift truck driver basically crashes into some pallets and knocks them over, they would automatically be tested. So you're not saying we do think you're under influence, but the regime is that we are going to test you to make sure you're not. And the last one is monitoring. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier on, about individuals who have come forward, they've gone through treatment, and what you generally do, and it works, you set up a small little contract with the individual which says that welcome back, nice to see you recovered, but you need to understand from our own due diligence, we will be carrying out testing on you over a period of, it could be 6 months or even a year. Periodically, randomly, we will have you tested. The individuals will sign up for that. Why? Because they've got a job. And they'll be happy to do that because you've supported them in the past and they've kept their job. So sort of rounding up now, I've probably given you lots of questions and things to go away to ask. So first of all, set out why the policy has been introduced and what your objectives are. Make it clear who the policy covers. And generally that should be from the managing director right the way through to the one to the guy who's making the tea. Talk to the employees at the early stage. Don't just drop it on top. You're going to have problems. You need to talk to them, explain why you're going to do it, and if it's, you know, and sell it in that way. Introduce a robust education program to your managers, especially your managers and your supervisors. If you've got trade union officials, bring them in as well. I've lost my screen. It's all gone. That's interesting. I'm sorry, it's one of these days, things today, isn't it? Keep going, right?
We can see you, Mike.
You can see me, yeah. That's all you need, really, isn't it? Okay. Also be clear on the principles of carrot and stick. If you're offering support, make very clear what the limits are of that support. Okay, make sure when you say we're going to give you support, make it very clear to what extent you're going to offer that. And also, we would always suggest you reinforce a drug and alcohol policy with a testing regime. Make very clear what constitutes a breach and the repercussions. We're back to this business of alcohol. If they're found and they fail a test, what the repercussions are. And also, before you go in it, it's always good once you get a policy to have it tested, put it in front of people who can help you look at a policy and give you some further advice at that development stage. And that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is the presentation. We're now over to any questions.
Well, thanks very much for that, Mike. Actually, I have received questions, but they've been coming through anonymously. So I'm not sure if you can see them, but I'll run through a number of them and see how you and Simon can answer these. Somebody has asked, how do you know which drugs to test for?
Do you want me to go for that one?
Yeah, carry on, Simon. Yeah.
Yeah, well, in essence, you don't really know what everyone's taking. It is an ongoing problem, but I think as Mike mentioned earlier on in the talk, there's a report produced by the European Drug Monitoring Service every year, which gives indications of the types of drugs and the level of use throughout the EU, including the UK. So it's always a good starting point. And basically what you'll find is you can buy a lot of the testing kits. They will generally cover the panel. We refer to the range of drugs you test for as the panel of drugs which are reflected by these European reports. They generally don't change a great deal. And the most common ones continue to be cannabis and cocaine and alcohol. So yeah, seek advice, look at the European report, and it's normally quite obvious. Maybe Mike wants to add something to that.
Yeah, I think as we explained, you've seen what the top ones are. Cannabis, most definitely, cocaine, MDMA, which is again one that's used a lot, ketamine, which originated from the veterinarian profession. Generally, again, there is a list of, I suppose, the top 6-7 favourite drugs out there at the moment, and they generally haven't been changed for some time now.
I mean, just as an interesting point, throwing an academic study point, what a lot of universities around the country do is they actually monitor sewage output. So they're looking at what's flushed down the toilet and what metabolites and breakdown products are coming from people, and then that gives a very good idea of what the general population are using. And I think, as Mike mentioned earlier, what's used in the general population is what you'll find happens at work.
Just a bit on that. One of a little bit of evidence we're slowly picking up. If we talk about cannabis has always been used as a recreation drug, was its term, where people would use it at sort of at home and in the evening, chilling out with their friends. There's some evidence to show now, and we've picked this up for employees, that this is creeping into being used in the workplace as well. Guys at lunchtime, they might be making their cigarettes at home, and at lunchtime they'll be having a break and they'll be smoking. We had one employer who actually said to us that in certain departments the personality of the workforce seemed to change after lunch. So there's some evidence to show that it's no longer a recreation drug; it's an everyday drug.
This is one for you, Mike, I think. What are the common mistakes made when companies write their initial drug and alcohol policy?
I think they tend to be very brief. They don't really think about the implications of what they're writing and the implications on it. Who it does can be a bit confusing, not very clear in who it means. And that really is it. They test to be. I mean, the most bland could be a sort of a two-sentence statement which says, you know, our policy is that you don't take drugs, you don't drink alcohol, and that's it, without it actually pointing out what the implications are to them in the employment stage.
Fairly similar question, actually. It says, what are the common mistakes made when companies start to think about introducing drug and alcohol testing into the workplace? And somebody else has answered a question, asked the question. It says, what is the view of the trade unions about drug and alcohol testing, and how is it best to enter discussions with the trade unions about the introduction of drug and alcohol testing?
One of the things that we've actually found with facing companies, well, first of all, the carrot has been tended to be the thing that softens the unions to allow you to introduce it or agree to introduce it. The other thing is how you argue, you know, because you're protecting your workforce, and that's their members. And I had a very serious face-to-face with a trade union official who at that stage was very resistant about it. And I actually said to him, how will you act if you have to go and face one of your members' wives because of an individual being injured as a result of a workplace drug or alcohol incident? How are you going to explain to her that you were against a testing regime that potentially could have stopped that happening? So you have to get an understanding that they may think it's draconian. It's not. You're helping. Yes, you're helping. You're protecting the company. You're protecting the workforce. So generally speaking, most unions they will not be happy, but they eventually agree to it. And this particular company, eventually, we did speak to the union official sometimes afterwards, and he was very shocked at the numbers of his members that were found to have failed drug tests. He didn't realise how rampant the problem was in his particular company.
I know once when we were helping to introduce drug and alcohol testing into a company in the aerospace industry, we organised a number of talks with trade union officials and senior management prior to the introduction of the testing, and that seemed to be quite helpful. Once somebody's asked, do you have to test for alcohol always?
We would generally say yes. We would generally say you involve the test as one. Just as actually we also say, companies that decide, oh, they just want to test for alcohol. In many cases, you can find an individual that's taking alcohol over the limit could also be taking drugs at the same time. It's not unusual to find someone failed an alcohol breath test and then find that he also had cannabis in their system at the same time.
Okay. This is possibly one for Dr. Simon. Somebody has asked, can the laboratories mix up the samples and even get the results wrong?
Gosh, can you prove a negative? It's be extremely rare for that to happen. They're very well organised, and all the laboratories that we're involved with are accredited to the International Standards Organization. There's a protocol called ISO 17025, which is incredibly stringent, multiple checks and multiple fail safes. So it's not impossible, but I certainly haven't seen the last 10, 15 years working in this area where a sample has actually been mixed up. So I don't think it's really something that needs to be worried about. And as technology improves, there are further checks going on at the point of collection for identification, electronic surveillance of the chain of custody from collection through to laboratory. So it's not totally impossible, but it's extremely unlikely. Is probably the best way of putting it.
But we're not intending to talk about collection at this end, but everything in terms of drug and alcohol collection is done under what's called a chain of custody process, where individuals are tested individually. All samples are barcoded and put into secure evidence proof bags, tampering proof bags. All the documentation is involved. Individuals sign for everything. They have to agree before they can be tested. And that applies to whether you've decided to go for urine or oral fluid. The samples are generally come in what we call an A and B sample, where the two test samples, when they go off, the samples will go off to the laboratory. One sample will be tested and the other secondary sample will be frozen and kept as a backup. So it's a very, very strict process that's done, and is done under the eyes of the donor at all times.
Okay. Now somebody's asked this question. That they've asked, should legal highs, well, they're now known as new psychoactive substances, be included in a drug and alcohol policy? Maybe that's one for both of you, actually.
It's to do more with the what sample it's being tested and what the legal high is. You know, they're mimics. Some will mimic marijuana, some will mimic cocaine. But as I say, Simon probably could give more in depth in terms of what the testing would be. But they do come under the umbrella of, they do tend to be picked up under conventional testing.
I mean, yeah, the short answer is, should we test for them? Absolutely. And as Mike says, they have the same deleterious effects of the drugs which they effectively mimic. I mean, we see, take a cannabis molecule and you slightly change the chemical structure, which means it can't be tested for as cannabis, but it still has the same effects and sometimes very much enhanced effects or increased effects. So these drugs are quite dangerous. In the standard screens that we carry out, the new novel psychoactive substances generally don't get picked up, although there is some cross-reactivity. But it is possible for an organisation to request an extra screen for these psychoactive compounds. So yes, they can be tested. Unfortunately, there is an added cost to that, which again has to go to your balance of scales, as Mike showed earlier, as to whether you want to implement that. I should say that Express, we are working on some new techniques where we can identify even unknown compounds, but that's going to be a few years off, I'm afraid. But yes, there are screening techniques which are out there for novel and so-called legal, or they're not legal anymore, but legal highs. And yes, if you feel necessary, you can use them. And I would recommend that, if possible, if that falls within your budgetary possibilities.
Thanks for that. Mike, somebody's asked if they were thinking about introducing drug and alcohol testing. Are there sectors that have well-established approaches and policies that would be seen as best practice that they might look towards?
Yeah, well, the one that jumps out would be the rail industry. I mean, they've been involved in drug testing since the early 90s, and so there would be a model. And certainly what's happened now is construction industries, where they've themselves have worked within the rail industry and therefore have to meet their needs. They themselves also have quite robust, and there's lots of good documentation out there to look at and use as a model. There's a lot of it out there now.
So I guess
the rail industry would be the one that I would say is the number one model.
So who would you go to, Mike, to see an example of a very good drug and alcohol policy? That's obviously a question that would follow from that.
Well, not blowing our own trumpet, but Express Medicals, we've got numerous documents, and we have within our own company we have a help regime where we will send companies an example for them to look at and model. And we also, obviously, when they're at a certain stage, they can send their own document in, and we can give advice on how robust we think their document is.
Okay, this is possibly one for you, Simon. Somebody's asked, is it okay to use instant tests as part of a drug and alcohol policy? And actually that is a relevant question in the light of some of the changes that are happening in the rail sector, I believe, at the moment.
Yes, I mean, there's always been some hesitance from using these instant tests or point of collection tests, the known POTS. Now, the reason is probably historical, and the fact that when they first came out, they weren't particularly good, and some big European studies which were hoping to show that they were good enough to use for roadside drug testing by the police. And unfortunately, that never really came to fruition, but that was some 15 years ago now. The technology has improved massively. The general public knowledge of these devices, because they use the same process as the lateral flow tests that we used for COVID. So we're all very familiar with them now. And so the combination of the improved accuracy of these tests and the improved general knowledge about these means I think they can act as a very important and useful tool for the screening stage of any drugs program. Now, what I mean by screening stage, this is the point where you can go out, you can take a test and say, is there anything abnormal with this sample? You can't definitively say whether someone's positive or negative. You'll need further confirmation. But what it means is you can identify someone who has something abnormal about their test. You can take a second test, send that off to a laboratory for full confirmation by using gold standard analytical techniques, generally something called mass spectrometry, which is almost 100% accurate. And then you can suspend the individual who's giving you the abnormal sample whilst that test is being done. Now, suspension under British law is a neutral act. So it means that if the result comes back as negative from the laboratory, you can say, very sorry, hope you enjoyed the few days off, please get back to work and carry on. And it also means that the employer can't be sued by, or legal action can't be taken by the employee for the suspension. So it works on both sides. So I suppose point out one of the benefits of doing this rather than just using the back to laboratory testing from the beginning. Number one, these point of collection tests are often a lot cheaper, so they're more economical. So you can carry out more tests if you want, or the testing program you already have can be fulfilled at a much lower price. And the second point is you do get an instant reading. The problem with the very accurate back to laboratory tests is that even if you rush that test results through, it's going to be 24 to 48 hours before you know what the result of that test is. And in that time, you could have somebody who was high at the point of collection of that sample carrying on with their safety critical role. So getting back into the cab of a train or operating machinery, and the potential is that injury or harm could accrue in that lag period between the sample being taken and the sample being tested at the laboratory. So this instant test, although not 100% accurate, is not as good as the laboratory test, is now sufficiently accurate to take instant action, which can then be confirmed later on through laboratory testing. So yes, I do think it's a very important part of modern testing programs and testing policies.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing you need to look at them is because they're now available for oral fluid and they're available for urine. The only issue here is that for urine, the process for collecting the sample is exactly the same as collecting it back to the laboratory. But the major difference is that you get an instant. We don't like using the term instant kits. They are, as Simon's saying, they are screening devices, but you do get a situation where you can get through your workforce a lot quicker, because at the end of the day, if the test shows negative, that's it. The testing process stops. And if on the other hand, the sample is shown to show what we call a presumptive positive, what will happen then is that sample would just be transferred into back to the laboratory set of files and would be sent off for the laboratory to do confirmation tests. So certainly I was quite resistant over a few years ago about the use of POTS, but now I think they are the future really, and would recommend their usage. And the only issue would be is what one you use, whether you go for oral fluid or whether you go for urine. And again, there's some discussion and argument, or to put that to understand what type of industry you've got and the facilities you've got in place, because oral fluid might be more suitable for you than going down the road of urine.
but you'd always have the laboratory confirmatory test as the backup from what you've both just said.
For a positive,
Okay.
for a non-negative, yes.
Just a couple more questions here. I think you covered this, Mike. Well, I know you did, but somebody's asked here. Are there any roles in a company that can be exempted from the testing program?
Well, actually, no. In terms of your 4 cores is concerned, but what they do tend not to be used for is the unannounced random testing, where you're going for a percentage of workforce. They tend to be concentrated within the safety critical area, but everybody in the company, right from the director right the way down, should be covered under the 4 cores test, which is where you've got reason to believe, or there's a road accident or something like that. They will be, or within the workplace, that they would be tested as well.
Okay, 2 final questions. Somebody's asked, so what is the best method of testing to use? I guess by that they mean, should they be using saliva or urine or hair or whatever? What's the advice there, actually?
Well, I might be different with Simon on this one. It's the time scale of between the two. I mean, the ones we're talking about really are oral fluid and urine. You can do hair testing, but it's very, very expensive, and it's not the sort of thing you would use in general employment. It tends to be used in the air industry, but in general employment you wouldn't use it en masse. It's the window that happens. Oral fluid, for instance, the beauty of oral fluid is you can do it in an office environment, a small room. The test can be done. It's not too evasive. Whereas, of course, urine testing, you need to have, the person has to void, that we have to have toilet facilities. It's a little bit longer, and people find it's more uncomfortable in terms of developing that. But there is some difference between the window of detection. But generally speaking, if you want to ensure that an individual at the workplace at that specific time is not taking drugs, then oral fluid will be more than adequate to do that. If you have got concerns of a person using it over a longer period of time, then urine would be the one that you would test, because it has a longer detection rate. So it depends, again, what you want as a company. Am I all right, Simon? Am I all right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I mean, one of the problems with the oral fluids, if you're looking for longer term detection, is if you're just looking for residue in the mouth, which can quickly get washed away. The benefits of the urine is you're not only looking at the parental drug, you're also looking at breakdown products which occur over much longer periods of time. So sometimes weeks, as opposed to maybe 12 hours or so for the oral fluids. I mean, one of the problems that keeps being brought up by some of our European colleagues is they say, well, what happens if we use a long-term test on a Tuesday, for instance, and you're detecting drug use, which is not having any physical effect or deleterious effect on that employee, a drug which they took over the weekend. There's the big thing, a lot of the French government, French people feel that you should be able to do whatever you want at the weekend, even if it's illegal. So you do have this sort of crossover. And it's, again, I think it's really down to what the needs are. The company, is the person really in a safety critical role, or just working in an office? I mean, on an analytical point, I'd probably always suggest using urine pox, but that I'm looking at as an analyst, not as a manager or a real world application. So yes, certainly something to consider carefully.
Throwing in a sort of a detection thing, on average, about 4% of drug testing tends to show positive. So if you look across your workforce and you're doing drug testing on a regular basis, the chances are you're going to pick up about 4% of individuals failing over a period of a year.
Yeah, it does vary sector to sector, Mike, doesn't it? I mean, in the military, it's much lower, of course. And good. There's one final question here, actually, which you've probably partially covered already. And it's just to say that when introducing a policy, who in the company should really be involved in deciding what the policy should contain and how it should be introduced.
The experts in it, well, agenda would be your HR would be the starting off if you've got a HR department, if not, but generally it should be, it's what triggers it. And you work backwards from why you're doing it. You know, if it's just fashion, then you need to have a much wider discussion. If it's as a result of incidents taking place, then you need to involve some of your workforce, shop stewards involved, certainly senior managers, frontline managers and supervisors, because they're the ones who are going to have to be implementing it. The more people you can get involved in it, but not to the scale where in the end it just becomes lobotomy. It's just too long and winded to get something developed. But really, as wide a group as you can, as far as consultation is concerned, but only for consultation.
Good. That's the end of the questions that I've been sent. So thanks very much to everybody for joining us, and I hope you found it interesting and helpful. Thank you.
Too.
Thanks very much.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye now
Thank
to
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye
Thank
now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.